Good afternoon, everybody. The next speaker, I would consider him truly a global character. We are lucky that he's with us today. There have been two people, I have known him for quite a few decades. There are two Britishers whom I kind of admire. He is one of them, and Jane Pettigrew is the other. She's also a good ambassador for tea, a world-class ambassador. Talking about Nigel, he has put in 38 years of tea in his career and has visited or worked in 28 countries. So what better person can we have in this forum? And this particular subject, what we are trying to do for the smallholders, I think he's a world-class authority on that, because I have visited several small plantations in different countries where, after his effort, they produce excellent teas that was being offered to us. So without further ado, I would like to present Nigel to speak today on this important global tea initiative. I'm sure he can assist us and help some of you as well as we go along. Nigel.
Actually, 30 countries. Right, brothers in tea, sisters in tea. I'm truly honored to present the keynote address today. I'm here as, you'd say, a scene setter. I could say a few cozy words about tea's illustrious past and present an anodyne picture of a star-spangled future. Or I could tell it warts and all. I could tell with my background of actually 40 years working in the tea industry, what I believe the future for tea will actually be. And as scientists and academics and seekers after truth, I think you deserve the latter, more honest approach today. Certainly, tea has a long history. It's resilient, it's survived, and it's thrived through more than 4,000 years. And today, tea is in high demand. Global supply is 12 billion pounds last year, 12 billion pounds of tea. And global production has actually doubled in the last 30 years. And tea is big business. Global market value was 46 billion in 2016, and it's projected to hit 68 billion in 5 years' time. So in today's tea world, it appears to be doing very well. A buoyant demand based on product innovation and health benefits in the developed markets, and a rising middle-class consumer base in Asian markets. So in today's world, tea is sitting pretty. But as responsible stakeholders in this industry, we must look closely at tomorrow's world. Like Cassandra, I must warn you there are issues on the horizon. There are elephants in the room. There are challenges that are not yet being addressed, are not yet even recognized. Challenges that will alter the tea industry and change tea as we know it. Sustainability is in the title of this symposium, but I fear sustainably will be severely challenged by some of the upcoming events. Now, you may not like or you may not agree with my predictions for the future of tea, but here at least they can and should be openly discussed. So in the next 40 minutes, I can only briefly outline the future challenges and possible outcomes. But this I can promise you, it will be a bumpy ride. I look to Bill Gates to help me out on this one. Bill Gates says that, or has been reported to say, that we always tend to underestimate in the short term, overestimate in the short term, and underestimate in the long term. So he's talking about 10 years. With a crop that will last 100 years, we have to take a really long-term view, I think, of the future. So I'm basing most of what I'm saying on a 30-year look into the future. So that's 2050 we're looking at. And 2050 is not all that far away. I've been in tea longer than that time span. So thank you, Bill. And let's look at today's tea world as a starting point. So this is our baseline. What's happening? We'll get up to date with what's happening in tea today. Here we see, top line there is tea production between 2004 and 2015. It's gone up from just over 3 billion tons a year to 5.2 billion tons a year. This last year was 5.6 million tons, sorry, got my billions and millions, 5.6 million tons, and the estimate for 2022 is it will be at 7.2 billion tons. And notice almost a straight line increase. Notice also that the line at the bottom, which is tea exports as opposed to tea production, tea exports are hardly increasing at all. All that increased production is being taken up in the producer countries, primarily in China and in India. And it's being taken up primarily because of population growth and because of increase in middle class buying power. Just to go through who are the big producers. Number 1 is China, number 2, India, number 3, Kenya. Just 2 countries grow 63% of all the tea in the world. The balance, the 37%, is distributed among 25 to 30 other smaller producers. So remember that order, China, India, Kenya. We look at who's exporting the tea, and we see that Kenya has leapt to the top. China's dropped number 2. Sri Lanka's coming into the picture. Those are the primary exporting countries, and they export nearly 2/3 of all the tea in the world. And again, the rest is distributed amongst small countries. Now, I talked about India producing, consuming, the graph looking straight line because countries were consuming their own. If we look at India, what's India's doing? It's since 1910. Between 1910 and 2006, so in a century, India has gone from consuming none of its tea, down here, to consuming Well, they're just below 80, but it now stands at 82% of all the tea that India produces is drunk at home. I put on here, just for comparison, the situation in Kenya. So Kenya now drinks only 6 or 7% of its own tea. Just think what will happen when Kenya starts to drink its own tea. It'll mean a shortfall on the world market of 400,000 tons. That's 21% of all the tea that's exported. Now, it's taken 100 years for India to drink 80% of its own tea. I suspect it's only going to take about 20 years for Kenya to turn over to being a big home consumer. That's going to make a massive dent on the world market. And you know that means high prices. So these are some significant current trends in tea. Buoyant market, increasing recognition of health benefits, rise of product innovation, rapidity of change in product, consumer and market, and supply chain awareness. The consumer wants to know about the supply chain. And of significance too, and we'll see why later, commoditization of tea and value addition to tea. Commoditization is when you have a supermarket doing this and using tea as a loss leader. An example of commoditization, these are figures from the UK market. You can see there the price of a single serving of sports drinks, energy drinks rather, dairy, juice, water, coffee, so forth. And look at how much tea is selling for per serving. That's 3p. And that's at regular sales price. When it's used as a loss leader, as it often is, this is our major supermarket in the UK. They are selling tea at 0.006 of a pound, which is less than a cent per serving, less than a cent per tea bag. You can't possibly get anything that's worth drinking for a cent in a tea bag. It costs you 2 cents to make the tea bag and another cent to put it in the box. And tea is being, unfortunately, people are losing they're not valuing tea because it's being offered at such a cheap price. And if that goes down back to the supply chain, you know who gets the hit. But value addition, fortunately, in the last 30 years, we've seen the specialty tea trend. You've actually got in the audience here the man who almost started single-handedly the specialty tea trend, Norwood Pratt. Value addition, here's an example. And yes, you saw it right. That tea is selling at £6,500 per kilo retail price. And that is just over $4,000 a pound. That is adding value to the extreme. But that tea ticks all the boxes for specialty tea. It's got a story, it's got an origin, it's from Hawaii, it's got transparency, it's got rarity, and it's got prestige. The Harrods endorsement, limited supply, artisanal production, agroecological husbandry, certified organic, grown in a cloud forest. It says it all. And that's the sort of price you can get for it. You won't get it all the time. They're getting it because they're the only one doing that. But that price was about 6 years ago, and they are still getting very, very high prices, over $1,000 a kilo at the farm gate. So, okay, now we're supposed to be here to consider the future of tea. If I had a crystal ball, I would predict, remember this one because you see if it came true. I predict we will see more changes in tea during the next 20 years than we've seen in the last 200. So let's look a little bit ahead. We'll say 30 years to 2050 and see what possibly might happen. Consider some of the drivers for change that are going to affect tea. In geopolitics, well, I'm not going to do anything with geopolitics. It's a curveball. I always think if I was standing here in 1990, would I have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union the next year? No, I don't think I would. Geopolitics is a ticklish game. We can talk about it over the bar, but I'm not going to tell you my ideas here. So I'll concentrate on urbanization. I'll concentrate on the ones that are more predictable. Urbanization, population growth, land scarcity, climate volatility, and technology. I think all of those are coming to a crunch point. I think the only possible positive driver in the list is technology. So those drivers for change that are pushing us, speeding us to a crunch point, we'll have a look at them and see what they look like. As I mentioned, urbanization, that causes a lack of agricultural workers. People are drifting to, not just drifting to the cities, they are rushing to the cities. Labor costs rise because of labor scarcity, because they've all gone to the city. Oil-related price increases affect tea right the way through the whole chain. The prices of agrochemicals, process energy, packaging, transport, all affected. The result of that is that it justifies mechanization. And with mechanization comes industrialization. Also, we have to consider climate volatility. We see droughts, floods, pests and diseases, all those reduce yield. And lower yields have a knock-on effect on cost of production. They also encourage short-term solutions. When there's a flood, people want quick action. And population growth, that is a given. And competition for land. We're going to have to grow a lot more food. In fact, 65% more needed by 2050. And that's going to give severe pressure on land. So that means that tea growing has to intensify to meet the increased demand. So we'll be using less land, and we'll be factory farming at the expense of quality. Now, don't get too unhappy. There is some bright light at the end of my presentation, but we have to face the facts. Just look at population growth in the world. That red line is, well, the red, the yellow, and the green line are the UN predictions for population growth over the next half century. Taking the yellow one, which is the more moderate, because no one believes that it's really going to stop, and follow the green one. And one hopes that it won't be the red one. So we'll take the yellow one. That gives us 9 billion people, 9 billion mouths to feed by 2040. That's an extra 1.4 billion mouths. Today, the population, I'll remind you, is 7.6 billion. When I was born, which doesn't seem so long ago to me, there were 2.3 billion. 2.3 billion to 7.6 billion in one lifetime. Right, so there's got to be a slowdown. But even with a slowdown, we're going to get into a crunch position. And we should remember the slowdown has results for sustainability, but not agricultural sustainability, but for economic sustainable economics, because our entire marketing system is predicated on always having more people to sell more goods to. But if we start getting less people or a reduced growth, that's going to upset market economies. So we've got an expanding population. We can't do much about it. We just don't know how fast it will expand. But the predictions are, I will give you the predictions. The first question is, where are they all going to live? Now, in 2010, that was a significant date for the world. It was a significant date because at that time, more people lived in cities than lived in rural areas. So man became, on balance, a city dweller. And now, that was 2010, already 54% are city dwellers. And according to the FAO, that's going to increase to 70%. Many other agencies think 80% by 2050. And all of, no, not all, 90% of those will be in megacities. And those megacities will be in Asia and Africa. Now, I was born in the city. I was born in London. I like cities. You know, I like that sort of city. It's got a buzz to it. Now, this is Shanghai. This is the Pudong district of Shanghai, looking over the river. That was swampland 30 years ago. They've done that in 30 years. But the reality of city dwelling is not the bright lights. The reality of urbanization is shacks, poorly built tenements, so often overcrowded conditions, dirt and poverty, tin shacks, stinking tenements. Walk around the wrong part of Nairobi, and you'll see typical sprawling urbanization. But the lure of that, the lure of the city is employment, high wages and opportunities. And it's all low-skilled employment, and it all comes out of the country. It all takes people out of the rural areas. So the knock-on effects of urban drift, knock-on effects are quite complex. Firstly, the service, as people get used to the cities, you will get service industries replacing the blue-collar labor. And as time goes by, the masses become middle class, much more middle class. They achieve middle class status. And more importantly, they achieve middle class aspirations. They do not want their children to work, particularly already they don't want their children to work on tea estates. And it's a nasty job. Out in the blazing sun or the pouring rain, plucking tea, anyone who's tried it will have tried it for half an hour. You try it for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. They don't want their children. They want their children to be doctors and lawyers. And you might say, quite so, but it leaves the problem behind. So just to come back to the increase in the middle classes, That means that more taxes are paid, which means that the city becomes more affluent. Affluence means technology reduces the need for labor, and you get to a post-industrialized position. By 2030, according to Ernst & Young, by 2030, 1 billion people in China will be considered middle class. That's 70% of the projected population of China will be in the middle classes. So that creates labor shortage. Just look at the wage rates on some Asian countries here. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. Look what happened to China over the last 25 years. The Chinese were getting 60 cents an hour down here. They're currently approaching $14 an hour. They're heading to what you would actually pay in the States. And this hits the tea industry particularly. It's unmechanized. Well, it was unmechanized. We'll go into mechanization in a moment. But when it started, it was unmechanized. And India particularly is suffering from, India is suffering from frequent labor shortages because people are going absent, they're doing other work rather than work on the tea estates, and they're taking frequent holidays. So, labor shortage, and I said there will be a land shortage. Now, just if we look at how we split up the land in the world, 58 million square miles is the total dry land in the world, and we split that up roughly into thirds. A third of it is unusable, a third is in forestry, and a third is in agriculture. And if we look at how the agricultural land is used, that splits up. Permanent pasture is over 2/3. So that third there, well, 28% is for arable crops. And permanent crops, where tea comes in, so our permanent crops are tree crops, nut crops, fiber crops, orchards. The permanent crops are just 3% of the total agricultural land, which gives for tea 23,200 square miles, which if you want it in acres, is 15 million acres. That's tea's share. Tea is quite tiny, really. And when there's pressure on land, I think tea is going to be pincered. Tea is a luxury crop, and when we need food, it's the luxury crops that are going to get squeezed. Just as an example, this is happening in India. Turn of last century, you could hardly give land away in India. Now it's running at $20,000 an acre for rural land. People are banking land. They're not growing things on it at the moment. They're banking land. Any land that's within 10 miles of a city is being bought up and taken out of production. So you'll say, well, you could say that that's 2013. What's happened since then? Well, rural land, in the average price of rural land in India is now at 28,000, and anything that's close to a city is going for $50,000 to $300,000 an acre. It's being bought up because it's going to be used for roads, hospitals, housing. So what is the tea industry doing about that? Well, I'll show you what the largest tea producer in the world is doing about it. And that company is India-based McLeod Russel. They have 53 giant estates and factories in India. But the lack of labor and the increasing cost of production there has prompted them to go to Vietnam, where they have now 7 estates, Uganda, where they have 5 estates, Rwanda, where they have 2 estates. So I think that adds up to 14. They've gone from 53 estates in India to an extra 14, but not putting them in India, but putting them overseas. You might note that Unilever, who had estates in India, have sold them all. In the last decade, they sold all their tea estates in India. Just this last year, they announced they are investing $50 million in tea estates in Rwanda. And there are other Indian companies who are putting estates into the Congo. Now, why those countries? Our next driver, global volatility, is the answer, because the center of Africa is going to be less affected than Kenya. Now, I know that climate change is always a bit of a contentious issue in the US. So I always call it climate volatility. But some of the predictions for climate volatility are pretty dire. Certainly, the Sahara is moving south. The monsoons are certainly being disrupted across Asia. There's fears that the meltwater from the Himalayas, which feeds the Assam tea, is going. Indications that the ice caps are going. There'll be a rise in sea level, and maybe even a loss of the Gulf Stream. Now, all climate change does affect agriculture. And if it's affecting agriculture, it's going to affect tea. Yes. Here's just one example of climate change, and that's from India. Now, Assam produces 56% of all the tea in India. And here's just a little history in the last few years of what's happened in Assam, particularly in the spring. 2012, they had very high rainfall and an increase in pests. In 2013 to 2014, they had a series of spring droughts which reduced yield. Huge record-breaking rainfall in 2016 with waterlogging, land erosion, and a big reduction in their first flush. And last year, devastating spring floods. They affected Bangladesh as well, and significantly reduced light levels, which has a very adverse effect on yield. The TRA, the Tea Research Association of India, and they do all the tea research for North India. This is their prediction. By 2050, unless measures are taken, much of Assam will be unsuitable for tea growing. Now, I suspect that they're being economical with the truth. I think in 10 or 15 years, we're going to see Assam go out of tea production. Over the last 80 years in Assam, we've seen a temperature rise of 3 degrees and a rainfall loss of 8 inches. And I think it's going to accelerate. And we've seen a change in taste of Assam tea. You can't get the Assam character anymore. And we're seeing gardens which, over the last 100 years, were carefully drained, are even so being waterlogged. They're being regularly waterlogged. Tea does not like wet soil. I took this picture when I was in Assam last in 2016, and it really it sums up the dilemma. So climate volatility is giving the wet conditions, and the drainage can't cope, but also because the subsistence farmers, the small farmers, need rice, they need rice more than tea, they are starting to encourage the water to rise. So you see this tea here, with a high water table, it's got hardly 12 inches of soil to get its roots down into. Tea doesn't like wet soil, so its root ball will only be 12 inches deep. When a drought comes along, there's no deep rooting, so the tea suffers. So the tea suffers both ways, from the waterlogging and when the droughts comes, and as I showed you in the last slide, they get alternate drought and flood. So the tea is at risk. Quick look at agriculture in 2050. But first, the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution did wonders for tea production, for food production. In 30 years, it increased by nearly 3 times. But the gains have slipped back. We're not seeing those rapid or even incremental gains anymore. The same thing happened with tea over those 30 years, but that is not going up as it was. So we need more food. Land will be in short supply. Food land will demand priority. Agricultural labor will be scarce and expensive, and all inputs will be more expensive. So the constraints that we're facing as I have outlined. Now, the responses available to us in tea or in agriculture, they're much the same. We can mechanize more, we can precision farm, we can transgenically breed as opposed to our conventional breeding, so GMOs. We can use protected agriculture, and we can use sustainable techniques. And Chairman Mao's edict in 1969, when the country was facing starvation, was the only way forward for agriculture is through mechanization. But before we come on to mechanization, we should look at sustainable farming. And this is the 1992 Rio definition of sustainability. And effectively, it says you should be putting in more than you take out. And since then, the definition has got more complex, and we talk about the 3 E's, and the 3 E's are E for economic viability, environmental stewardship, and social equity. So the argument for sustainability is incontrovertible. reality, geopolitical apathy, procrastination, and time pressure of events may make it difficult to achieve. We don't have the luxury of time. Now, sustainable systems favouring renewable and carefully husbanding non-renewables would be the choice rather than unsustainable farming. But with so many mouths to feed, it's a big ask. Look at this. This is what we take out. Every time we take a ton of tea off the land, this is what we take out in terms of kilograms of NPK. Now, if we multiply that by the 5.6 million tons, that means we need 250,000 tons of nitrogen a year. Currently, that comes from methane, primarily from methane. We need 138,000 tons of potassium, which we dig up from fossil sources. We need nearly 30,000 tons of phosphorus, which we dig up from fast depleting resources. Phosphorus will peak in 2030, and then it's going to run out. So that's what we need. If we were to go to organic farming for all our tea needs, it would take 100 million tons of fresh cow manure, that's a hell of a pile, to fertilize all the tea that we are growing at the moment, let alone what we envisage in the future. Right, let's imagine we're in 2050 now. So we can say, how did agriculture shake down in 2050? Well, I think productivity is just about coping, but it had to make very tough choices. Farming had to become far more intensive. That means loss of biodiversity, which is one of the keystones of sustainability. Much rainforest will have gone. Sustainability will have lost out. Yields were boosted, but with reduced quality. GMOs are being used for most food products because it gives you fast development. It takes 25 years to develop a new tea variety. 25 years. It's not like developing a cereal crop. So we will have embraced new technologies, yeah. Vertical farming is already a given in some countries. Singapore is producing a ton a day of salad crops. But vertical farming and protected farming only work in affluent economies. Yeah, in the US, in Singapore, in Europe, that'll be fine. But they can't afford the investment in India, well, not at the moment, and Africa. Automated production for niche crops that can afford the capital investment. And we will have, by 2050, reduced some of that awful food waste. Half the food that's produced in the developing country is lost through bad storage. Half the food that's produced in a country or bought in a country like this, half of it is wasted. So we'll have improved storage by 2050, and we'll have perhaps must reduce excessive consumption and over-marketing. And we'll have shifted away from meat production. That 2/3 of the agricultural land which is put down to pasture is just not sustainable. Animals are very inefficient producers of food. And in 2050, agriculture will be competing very hard for land against non-food uses. So it looks like intensive farming. It's significant, I think, that China is already trying to emulate the US low-manned, high-tech intensive farming. They bid for Syngenta, or they bought Syngenta for $43 billion. Monsanto was after Syngenta. The Chinese got Syngenta. That's their aim, is to make their agriculture as efficient as American agriculture. So, how is tea going to fare in this? Well, tea is already facing up to some of the issues, not quickly and not as fast as they should, but it's already looking at some of them. Because of the drivers that we've been talking about, tea is rapidly introducing mechanized harvesting. A lot of the multinationals who can afford the money are improving their science, their technology, and particularly their management of the land. As I showed you, new tea land is opening up, particularly in Africa. And there's artisanal tea growing, springing up in the USA and also in Europe. So those are some of the responses. But if you compare two tea companies who are losing money, one may take the choice of reducing costs to get out of the mire, and the other will consider adding value to increase their prices and maintain their cost of production. So the shape of the tea industry in 2050, I think it will polarize distinctly into two camps who will be very different from one another. Firstly, what I call industrial tea, and that will be high volume, low margin. It's going to be heavily mechanized, not only mechanized, but automated. It will sacrifice quality to maintain its market by low pricing. And the tea they produce, you probably wouldn't recognize. They will be producing extracts, tea extracts. There will be some of you who were at World Tea Expo 2 years ago may have seen a product called Infuse. Now, Infuse is a very interesting product that I think is going to be very much more seen in the future. You all know that paper is made from cellulose, and you must realize that tea leaves are made from cellulose. This company, a French company, not a tea company, but a paper company, has very cleverly taken tea leaves, extracted the tea juice, if you like, out of the tea leaves, turned the tea leaves into paper, and before they dry the paper, reintroduced the tea extract onto the paper. Then you can roll your tea up in a roll, and you can do anything with that roll, that paper on the roll. You can put it through a factory. You can do anything that you can do with paper. You could do origami with it. You could make teacups out of it. So you can infuse your tea in the teacup without any loose leaf. You could make tea books. You could print on it. You could... The uses are limited only by the imagination, as we used to say in product development, when we couldn't think of any more. No, I think the industrial tea producers will go that route, and there will be specialty tea in 2050. But a very different camp. It'll be still offering high quality. It'll be mainly hand-plucked. It'll offer novelty and service, and that would justify its high price. Now, I've talked about mechanization. When I came into the tea industry, mechanization was at about 2%, primarily Japan. And fortunately, the first tea estate I worked on was a mechanically harvested tea estate. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about tea when I started. I thought all tea was harvested like that because in England, in America, all crops tend to be mechanically harvested. So I thought, well, it's mechanically harvested, so what? The next country I went to was Sri Lanka, and I got a shock to see people actually plucking tea by hand. Now, if you look at the growth of mechanization, in a very short time, we've come from, as I said, 1980, I came into tea, and it was 2 or 3%. It's now 50% and going up very quickly. And I think what's going to happen by 2050 is it's going to plateau. It's going to be coming in at about 90% of all tea will be mechanically harvested and of dubious quality. And that 10% at the top there will be selectively hand-plucked in the old-fashioned way. But hand-plucking will be 10 to 20 times more expensive than the machine plucking. So that the specialty tea producers are going to be doing much as they do today. The savvy ones, I think, will diversify and innovate to provide more novelty than we've got at the moment, but it'll be of high quality, and that high quality will be both in the product and in the service. I talk about specialty tea. Here's some data on the progress of specialty tea in this country. This is the total sales of specialty tea. And you can see in 30 years how it's risen. So 2014 at $1.9 billion. And that's the Tea Association of the United States figures. Now, is that going to carry on? Well, their prediction for 2018 is actually off the graph. It's that spot up there. It's going to be 2.5 billion. And that is, in value, 19% of all the US retail sales is going to be specialty tea. Green tea, white tea, black tea, special origins, phenomenal. So quickly, and we're coming to near the end, here's what we see if we look at the tea industry at the moment. We see conventional tea, huge amount. We see a fair amount of sustainably grown tea. In fact, Unilever, Lipton, Brook Bond, Unilever said by 2015, all our tea will be Rainforest Alliance. And they're on track with that. So you can say they pack 12% of the world's tea. And Tata are also online. Tata is the second biggest packer. So the amount of sustainable tea at the moment is, I guess, about 20% of all the tea grown in the world is sustainable. And that is sustainable on big estates. And you'll see that the specialty teas overlap there with commodity tea. Specialty teas have organic tea and biodynamic tea, which doesn't overlap with commodity tea, but the sustainable tea is somewhere in the middle, and specialty tea and commodity tea in the middle, there's a grey area. Now, what's going to happen in 2050 is, I think, there's going to be a dichotomy. The commodity tea, what I call commodity tea, is going to be the industrial tea, the hardly recognizable tea. We might even not call it tea. There may be a small amount of sustainable tea still being produced outside the specialty tea category for tea bags in supermarkets, perhaps. One of my definitions of specialty tea is it's not grown in the supermarket. I mean, it's not sold in the supermarket. But even when people are buying tea extracts, mainly in ready-to-drinks or in paper format, there'll be some people still wanting tea bags which will be poor quality, but they will be, I think, sustainably produced. But the specialty teas will have pulled apart, and 100% of all the specialty teas will be either sustainable or organic or biodynamic, or combinations of them all. And hand-plucked tea will dominate in that specialty tea area, although I'm expecting selective harvesting machines to come along. There are one or two which are claiming to be selective, so I think we're going to see an improvement in harvesting machinery. But there'll still be people who will pay top dollar for that hand-plucked specialty. It gives them a thrill to know it's hand-plucked. Right. So in summary then, what do we see for the future of tea? As I've said, 9 billion plus, 80% living in sprawling cities, world agriculture and resources stretched, struggling tea industry, trying to get the same volume or even more volume on less land with less labor and higher input costs. And tea producers will have chosen their business model. The commodity tea producers, the industrial tea producers, using advanced technology to stay solvent, and the specialty tea makers using their traditional ways of doing it. So if we look 20 to 30 years ahead, the 10% specialty tea camp will include the tea entrepreneurs that we heard from this morning. They will include the small farmers that we'll hear from tomorrow. And that camp will retain its traditional values. It will be still embracing green, sustainable credentials and an element of tea culture. And savvy producers in that group will build on the distinction between specialty tea and the industrial tea. And we can leave, I think, industrial tea to its ignoble fate. So my last prediction for today, last one I promise you. I think smart operators who bought and freeze-stored inventory of specialty teas in this year will be making a fortune by selling it in 2050. That's where I'd put my money. And yes, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Thank you. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you for those fascinating, if sobering, remarks. Would you entertain some questions?
Of course.
We will take some questions. Please use the microphones on the side. I'll help facilitate, and you answer.
Done.
This is your chance.
Nigel, thank you
Hi.
so much for the presentation. I think we're all trying to take it in a little bit. But I wanted to hear your perspective on China in particular, where people cannot own land. And from what I've seen, I feel like that's maybe the biggest barrier to tea companies investing in mechanization. Even though labor prices are increasing, I still don't see a lot of mechanization because where are you going to buy, plant the tea, which takes a long time, and install the tracks and buy the equipment if you might not have the land again in 20 or 30 years. So I was just wondering if you had a perspective on that.
I didn't hear all of that.
Can you say it a little bit louder?
Sorry.
Very well.
So I was just asking about China, where people can't own land. So if you're a tea company, you have to lease the land. I've seen maybe 20 or 30-year leases, but I don't think longer than that. So, why would tea companies invest in the mechanization like Japan does? So I think
Okay,
that's kind
yeah.
of a barrier to mechanization in China.
It's a good question, and I was in China last year, and I was in Hubei province, I saw what I had heard was happening there, how the Chinese, who are very pragmatic people, what they're doing is they're taking the first flush, they're bringing people back from the cities for the first flush, the family coming back, they're paying people to come back for the first flush, which is the expensive flush. And they hand-make tribute tea or very high-quality tea in the first flush, and it's hand-plucked. In the second harvest, the summer harvest, they use machines. They use handheld harvesters, and that goes for what you might call commodity green tea. That's the tea that people drink every day, rather than the tea that they give people as presents. And in the autumn, when the quality of the bushes, the quality of the leaf is far lower, they machine harvest that as well, and that goes off to the factories that do tea extracts. So they have very cleverly introduced mechanical harvesting without upsetting what their handmade production. Now, I don't know any other country that does that.
Thank you, Nigel, for your talk and your predictions. In the beginning of your talk, you had predicted that by 2050, the tea market would be polarized into this industrialized tea and specialty tea. But then on the charts that you showed, there's kind of that sustainable tea that is kind of bridging the two, even in your prediction. So I'm wondering, what is that sustainable tea, and how did that get in the middle there?
You mean? So, this one here? Well, I don't think that the industrial tea will go that way 100%. I think there will always be, particularly in older people who don't want to be drinking out of a can, there will always be a demand for tea bags. So I think there will be people who hang on to the concept of sustainability and will be producing tea which is suitable for tea bags. Primarily because I didn't really want to put just a big blue blob. I'm a great believer in the 80-20 rule. And I can't believe that there won't be some, because Unilever, Tata have done such a good job with sustainability in tea. It really is a credit to them that they've done it. That I don't think they will certainly in 20, 30 years, have come out of that completely. But I'm sure it will be less than it is at the moment, and all the new tea will tend to be industrial.
Thank you first for the, I think, for the sobering outlook. No, thank you. I'm curious, given all the development that's happening in the Congo and Rwanda, what's the outlook in terms of climate volatility for those?
Okay, yeah.
For those areas?
There are various models and various predictions, and nobody knows which one is really the best, but the sort of consensus of them all is that, and to some extent we're seeing this happening on the ground already, that Kenya will get hotter and drier. Now, Kenya has two tea areas, east of the rift, where, if you want it, the tea bag tea comes from, and west of the rift where the tea bag comes from, and east of the rift where the smallholders grow their tea, and that is much higher quality. Now the difference between east and west of the rift, on the east, where we have the commodity tea, they're at about 4,000 feet, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and what's happening there, the temperatures are increasing, so people are planting new tea at higher elevations. So they're moving up the mountains. On the west side, there's no more mountain to go up. On the east side, there's Mount Kenya, that you could go all the way to the top. The problem with going up mountains to solve your problem is that if you've got 1,000 hectares at the base of the mountain, you've got only a square meter at the top of the mountain. So the higher you go, the less land there is. But all the predictions are that Kenya will be vastly affected, whereas Uganda, being further in, is not so likely to be affected so soon. And Rwanda is on a lake. The Congo is, right central to west and is looking like it might keep its rainfall. So that's the reason.
Thank you.
Hi, Nigel. Thank you for your thought-provoking comments and lecture today.
Closer to the microphone.
Sure. I just wanted to ask, how would you see, and I think you know my bias is towards Nepal and Nepalese teas, and I see, like, with what we've discussed today, it kind of seems like a bleak future for me for a country like Nepal, because they have the issues that you described in the beginning of labor migration, and they don't have mechanization, and they don't have the volume to be in this industrial bubble, the blue bubble. So how would you see a country like that getting into the specialty tea with the issues that are facing, or are we just looking at a field that's going to be a decrease in terroir for specialty teas?
Jenny, I think it's going to be hard for countries like Nepal, hard for Darjeeling, and hard for Sri Lanka too, where it's very difficult to mechanize because of the terrain. So far, we haven't cracked the way of improving the harvesting without destroying the quality in those situations. Now, I'm a great believer in human ingenuity, in particular, when they say necessity is the mother of invention, and I think people will concentrate their minds on improving mechanization, but at the moment, nothing has been done that's really suitable for tea growing when it's on 45-degree slopes. That said, I went to the Cameron Highlands a long time ago, 20 years ago, and they were harvesting with machinery on slopes which previous to that, I thought were impossible. And the other midway house is to do shear plucking, because you can negotiate steeper slopes doing the shear plucking. But the tendency is that people who are shear plucking are given the shears because the managers want volume rather than quality. I think if people were incentivized to shear pluck delicately, then it would be much better quality. So I can't give you any better hope than that.
So I want to ask a question following up on that and related to what you were saying about some of the large tea companies investing in estates in Rwanda. Rwanda is a very mountainous, I mean, it's the country of 1,000 hills. It's very mountainous. So why are they investing there beside the climate issue if you're still going to face that other issue?
Well, I think you said it. It's the country of the 1,000 hills, not 1,000 mountains. The slopes are much less steep and much less rocky than you get in Darjeeling or Nepal. But for the moment, most of in fact, all of the harvesting in Rwanda is by hand, not mechanized. But it is suitable for mechanization. Nord.
Nigel, thank you for your bluntness. I think it's left all of us rather stunned. But don't leave us with no hope at all. Let me ask you, you have not discussed biodynamic agriculture, and I'm happy to see you predict it will persist to some measure. Talk to us about biodynamics and what's happened there.
It's not my specialty, but biodynamic, I think the last time I looked, it was about 0.001% of the world's tea is biodynamic. It's a very small, very specialist system, which at its most extreme verges on the mystic. Planting by the moon and fertilizing by putting ground up quartz in a cow's horn and taking 40 days to produce liquid fertilizer from cow urine and cow manure. I don't laugh at these things because people do it seriously and they produce some very nice teas. But you're never going to produce 5.6 million tons of tea in that way. And in terms of giving you hope, yes, Norwood, 10% of the world's tea will be specialty tea. 10%, I mean, well, 5.6 billion now, 7.2 million is predicted. 10% of that is an awful lot of specialty tea, much more specialty tea than we're producing at the moment. So I think there is hope. But the total amount of tea, if you include now the commodity tea, of course the total amount of what I call real tea will be lower, but it will be, much more of it will be specialty tea. I discount industrial tea as, in fact, I think the marketers will get another name for it.
Hi, I had a two-part question. One, are you equating mechanization to progress? And then the next question is, what do you view as progress?
I don't equate it to progress, I equate it to necessity. Without mechanization, we would already be getting less tea coming in. And the demand, as you can see, the demand is going up every year. And the only way we can actually meet that demand is to mechanize. What do I define as progress? I'm not too sure. It's a ticklish one, that.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
I was just wondering, so we assume that the population is going to increase to around 9 to 10 billion people, and then we simultaneously assume that therefore middle class is going to increase and incomes are going to rise, labor costs are going to increase. But then, like with India today, China today, and hopefully Kenya tomorrow, that would also then assume that people would be increasing their domestic consumption of tea. And wouldn't that also assume that specialty tea share, like the market share of specialty tea versus commodity tea, would also increase? I was kind of wondering, because you have here in this slide, in the previous one, it looks sort of like commodity tea and specialty teas are about the same sizes as before, sort of. Like relationship-wise, the doesn't seem like the market share of specialty tea has increased too much, if at all. And I was just wondering if you think that specialty tea will increase like that compared to commodity tea.
Well, I'm not too sure about the percentages, the amounts. What I am sure is that this dichotomy will occur. It's a bold prediction to say, it will be one thing or the other, although I have been so bold as to say so. But, there's a margin of error on all predictions. And, but I think you'll find that already we're getting this dichotomy and it's going to continue. And I think the drivers that are here will particularly make that happen.
Well, let's thank our speaker.